May 23, 1992. A little after 5:30 in the afternoon. A dry Saturday on the Sicilian coast, the light going gold over the sea, the traffic on the A29 motorway moving fast toward Palermo. On a low hillside above the little town of Capaci, a heavy-set man of 34 crouched behind a scrap of cover with a modified remote control in his hands. He had a clear line of sight down to the roadway. He had a stopwatch running in his head, and buried in a drainage culvert beneath the asphalt, packed tight where no passing driver would ever see it, sat roughly 400 kilograms of explosive, nearly 900 pounds, wired and waiting. The man on the hill was Giovanni Brusca. In the language of his world, he was called verru, Sicilian for the pig. Others called him Lo Scanacristiani, the slayer of Christians, the cutthroat of men. By his own later account, he had already killed so many people that he had genuinely lost count. When investigators pressed him, the number he reached for landed somewhere between 100 and 200 souls. He was not a soldier who had drifted into violence. He had been raised for it. Down at Palermo's airport, at Punta Raisi, a small convoy had just pulled away. 3 armored cars running fast. In the middle vehicle sat Judge Giovanni Falcone, Italy's most famous anti-Mafia magistrate, the architect of the great Maxi trial that had sent hundreds of mafiosi to prison, the investigator who had taught his country to hunt the Mafia by following its money. Beside him was his wife, Francesca Morvillo, herself a magistrate. Ahead and behind rode their police escort. They were driving home for the weekend. They had no idea that the road itself had been turned into a bomb, or that a man was watching them from the hills with his thumb near a button. That button, and the man who pressed it, sit at the center of everything that follows. Because here is the paradox we have to reckon with. Giovanni Brusca was not born a monster in some vacuum. He was born into the Mafia, the way other children are born into a farm or a family trade. His father was a boss. The organization was, quite literally, the family business, and from boyhood, Giovanni understood that killing was simply part of the work. He would become one of the most prolific murderers in the modern history of organized crime. And then, in one of the strangest reversals in the annals of Italian justice, this same man, the pig, the people slayer, the man who killed Falcone, would be captured, would turn, would become a protected witness for the very state he had waged war against, and would eventually walk out of prison a free man. How does a person travel that road? How does a boy from a hill town outside Palermo become the hand that detonates a massacre broadcast to the whole world, and then become an asset the state chooses to protect? To understand the man on the hill at Capaci, we have to go back, up into those hills, to a town called San Giuseppe Giotto, and to the family that made him. Because before Giovanni Brusca was the man who killed Falcone, he was somebody's son. Giovanni Brusca was born on the 20th of May, 1957, in San Giuseppe Giotto, a town of tight streets and stone houses in the hills southwest of Palermo. It was farming country on the surface, vineyards, olives, grazing land, and mafia country underneath, one of the old strongholds where Cosa Nostra had ruled the rhythms of life for generations. Into this world Giovanni arrived as the son of Bernardo Brusca, a senior boss who commanded the San Giuseppe Giotto clan. There was no line, in that household, between the family and the organization. The Mafia was the inheritance. The name Brusca opened doors, closed mouths, and carried the weight of blood already spilled. A boy raised in such a house learned the code the way other children learned catechism. He learned that silence, omerta, was sacred, that debts were paid in kind, that the state and its laws were an enemy to be outmaneuvered, and that violence, applied coldly and without hesitation, was the currency of respect. By his own later testimony, Brusca was drawn into the workings of Cosa Nostra as a young man and was formally initiated, made, into the organization, sworn in by the old ritual of the burning holy card and the oath of loyalty unto death. He was still very young when he began to kill, and he showed early the quality that would define his career. He did not flinch. The Sicily of Brusca's coming of age was not stable. In the early 1980s, the island was torn apart by the Second Mafia War, a campaign of extermination that ran roughly from 1981 into 1983 and left the streets of Palermo in mourning. On one side stood the old Palermo families. On the other stood the Corleonesi, the faction from the town of Corleone, led by the cold, relentless Salvatore Riina, known as Toto Riina, a man whose ambition was nothing less than to rule all of Cosa Nostra as the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of bosses. The Corleonesi did not merely fight their rivals, they hunted them down, family by family, until the opposition simply ceased to exist. When it was over, Riina and Corleone had won, and the Corleonesi held the whole organization in an iron grip. Giovanni Brusca rose inside that machine, and he rose because he was useful to Riina. He became one of the boss of bosses' most trusted enforcers, a man Riina could point at a problem and know the problem would disappear. Brusca had a reputation for a particular kind of cold efficiency. He organized, he planned, and his loyalty to Riina was, in this period, total. He had absorbed the Corleonesi creed that the organization's enemies were to be destroyed absolutely, without sentiment and without limit. The nicknames attached themselves to him along the way. Verru, the pig, for his appearance and his appetites and the sheer animal quality of his violence. Lo Cristiani, the one who slaughters human beings, for the growing tally of the dead. These were not names given lightly, even among men who killed for a living. By the second half of the 1980s, then, the pieces were in place. The Corleonesi controlled Cosa Nostra. Riina sat at the top, feared even by his own men, and beneath him stood a generation of hardened soldiers like Giovanni Brusca. What none of them yet fully grasped was that a different kind of war was coming, not against rival clans, but against the Italian state itself. And the man who would light that fuse was already sitting in a courtroom in Palermo, quietly assembling the case that would shake Cosa Nostra to its roots. His name was Giovanni Falcone. To Cosa Nostra, Giovanni Falcone was not merely an inconvenience, he was the enemy, the single most dangerous man the Italian state had ever thrown against them. A Palermo magistrate, Falcone had done something no investigator before him had truly managed. He had learned to read the mafia from the inside. He pioneered the method of following the money, tracing the flows of cash through banks and shell accounts to map an organization that survived on silence. And he had won the trust of the first great pentito, Tommaso Buscetta, a made man who broke omerta and described the structure of Cosa Nostra as no outsider ever had, its rules, its hierarchy, its ruling commission. What Buscetta's testimony and Falcone's method produced was the Maxi trial, the Maxi Processo, which opened in a specially built bunker courtroom in Palermo in 1986 and ran into 1987. It was a spectacle without precedent. Hundreds of defendants in cages along the walls, and at the end of it, hundreds of convictions. For the first time, the Italian state had proven in open court that Cosa Nostra was a single, structured criminal organization. Still, the men in the cages consoled themselves with an old certainty, that convictions in Sicily had a way of dissolving on appeal. For years that certainty held like a promise. And then, in January of 1992, it shattered. Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation upheld the Maxi trial verdicts. The convictions were final. The state had won, and it had won because of one man's method and one man's persistence. For Toto Riina, this was intolerable, and it was personal. The boss of bosses took it as a declaration of war, and he resolved to answer it in the only language he trusted, Cosa Nostra would strike back not at rival clans this time, but at the Italian state itself, at the magistrates, the politicians, the symbols. And at the top of the list stood the architect of it all. Giovanni Falcone had to die, not quietly but spectacularly, in a way that would announce to the entire nation that the Mafia could reach anyone, anywhere. The task of turning that decision into a killing fell to men like Giovanni Brusca. Through the spring of 1992, the plotters studied Falcone's movements. They knew he had taken up a role in Rome, but returned often to Palermo, flying in on weekends. They watched the pattern, the arrivals at Punta Raisi Airport, the fast convoys of armored cars, the route the escort took along the A29 motorway toward the city. And in that route, they found their opportunity. A stretch of highway near the town of Capaci, an ordinary length of road with a drainage culvert running beneath it, invisible from the traffic above. There, in that culvert, they built their weapon. Working in secret, the plotters packed the drainage channel beneath the motorway with roughly 400 kilograms of explosives, enough to tear the road itself apart. They ran the wiring, they chose the vantage point on the hillside, and they tested the remote detonation system, rehearsing the timing, because everything would depend on a single moment, the instant the target's car crossed the buried charge. Brusca would be the man on the hill. On the afternoon of the 23rd of May, 1992, he took his position above Capaci with the detonator, and he waited, watching the highway shimmer in the late sun. Far down the road, the phone call came that the convoy had left the airport. 3 armored cars, moving fast toward Palermo, carrying Judge Giovanni Falcone, his wife, Francesca Morvillo, and their police escort, Antonio Montinaro, Rocco Di Cillo, and Vito Schifani, home for the weekend. Brusca fixed his eyes on the marker he had chosen on the road. The cars swept into view, closing the distance, 100 meters, then less. And on the hillside, the pig lowered his thumb toward the button. At 5:56 on the afternoon of 23rd May 1992, Giovanni Brusca pressed the button. From a hillside above the A29 motorway near Capaci, he watched Judge Giovanni Falcone's 3-car convoy sweep along the coastal road, and when the lead vehicle crossed the mark, he closed the circuit on a remote wired to roughly 400 kilograms of explosive. The world tore open. A section of the motorway simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater and a rolling wall of dust and pulverized concrete. The blast was so violent that it registered on seismographs. People in Palermo, miles away, felt the ground shudder and thought an earthquake had struck. When the smoke cleared, the scene on the A29 was one of apocalyptic ruin. The lead escort car, carrying officers Antonio Montinaro, Rocco Di Cillo, and Vito Schifani, had taken the full force of the detonation. The 3 young men were killed instantly. Falcone's armored car, following behind, had slammed into the sudden chasm at speed. The judge and his wife, the magistrate Francesca Morvillo, were pulled alive but gravely wounded from the wreckage and rushed to the Civico Hospital in Palermo. For a few desperate hours the nation held its breath. But the injuries were beyond saving. Giovanni Falcone died that evening. Francesca Morvillo died shortly after. The man who had spent his career dismantling Cosa Nostra was gone. The response was volcanic. Italy convulsed with a grief that curdled instantly into fury. Falcone was not merely a dead official, he was a symbol, and Cosa Nostra had murdered him in broad daylight with a bomb powerful enough to reshape the earth. The message was unmistakable. The state could protect no one. Rina and the Corleonesi had declared, in the most brutal grammar available to them, that they were not afraid of Rome. Falcone's funeral, held in the Basilica of San Domenico in Palermo, drew crowds so vast they overflowed the square. Ordinary Sicilians who had long lived in a code of silence stood weeping openly, and something in that silence began at last to crack. The most searing moment came from Rosaria Costa, the young widow of escort officer Vito Schifani, barely in her 20s, dressed in black, who rose before the microphones and the television cameras of a watching nation and addressed the killers directly. Her voice breaking, she pleaded with the men of the Mafia to convert, to fall to their knees and change. "I forgive you," she cried, "but you must get on your knees." It was broadcast into every home in Italy, and it did what 1,000 indictments had not. It gave the abstraction of Mafia terror a human face and a human wound. But if the state believed that Capaci was the final horror, they were catastrophically wrong. Inside Cosa Nostra, the leadership was not chastened by the national outcry. They were emboldened. Rina, still at liberty, had another target already in his sights, Paolo Borsellino, whose name had been paired with Falcone's for years as the twin scourges of the Sicilian Mafia. Borsellino knew he was next. In the weeks after his friend's death, he told those close to him that he could hear the fuse of his own bomb burning. On the afternoon of July 19, 1992, barely 57 days after Capaci, Paolo Borsellino walked toward his mother's apartment building in Via D'Amelio, a narrow residential street in Palermo. A car packed with explosives had been parked at the curb. As Borsellino approached, the bomb was detonated. The magistrate was killed, along with 5 members of his police escort, Agostino Catalano, Emanuela Loi, one of the first Italian policewomen to die in the line of duty, Vincenzo Limuli, Walter Eddie Cosina, and Claudio Traina. Though the Via D'Amelio bombing was carried out by other hands within Cosa Nostra, it belonged to the same campaign, the same open war on the Italian state that Capaci had begun. In fewer than 2 months, the Mafia had decapitated Italy's anti-Mafia leadership. Italy stood at the edge of something no democracy in Western Europe had faced in decades. An armed criminal organization waging deliberate, spectacular terror against the machinery of the state itself. And the men who had built this campaign were not finished. They believed the bombs had made them untouchable. What they did not yet understand was that they had awakened a response that would, in time, consume them. When Salvatore Rina was finally captured on January 15, 1993, arrested in Palermo after more than 2 decades as a fugitive, the state exhaled, but Cosa Nostra did not surrender. Instead, the surviving leadership, with Giovanni Brusca among its principal organizers, chose to answer the loss of their capo with an escalation more audacious than anything before. They carried the war to the Italian mainland. If bombs in Sicily had shaken the state, bombs against Italy's cultural heart would force it to negotiate. And so the Mafia turned its explosives against the treasures of the nation itself. On the night of 27 May 1993, a car bomb detonated in Via dei Giorgiofili in Florence, in the shadow of the Uffizi Gallery. The blast killed 5 people, including an entire family, Fabrizio Nencioni, his wife Angela, and their 2 young daughters. The historic Torre dei Pulci collapsed. Priceless works in the Uffizi were damaged. Then in July of that year, the bombs struck again on the mainland, in Milan, at Via Palestro, where an explosion killed 5 people, and in Rome, where blasts near ancient churches were meant to strike at the very soul of Italian civilization. Brusca was among those later tried and convicted for this strategy of terror. The men of Cosa Nostra had become, in the plainest sense, terrorists. Yet for all the horror of the mainland bombings, the crime that would forever brand Giovanni Brusca as a monster, a word used even inside the Mafia, was more intimate and more unbearable than any explosion. It began with betrayal, as Brusca saw it. Santino Di Matteo, a mafioso who had taken part in the Capaci plot alongside Brusca, had been arrested and had done the unthinkable. He had turned pentito, become a state witness, and testified about the bombing that killed Falcone. To men like Brusca, there was no sin greater than collaboration with the state. and so Brusca devised a punishment designed to break Santino through the thing he loved most. In November 1993, Brusca ordered the kidnapping of Santino Di Matteo's young son, Giuseppe. The child was lured away by men posing as police officers, told they were taking him to see his father. It was a lie. From that moment, the boy vanished into the Mafia's underworld, held captive in a series of hideouts across Sicily, moved from place to stay ahead of the investigators searching for him. He was kept in chains. Proof of his captivity was sent to his father as an instrument of pressure. Retract your testimony, or the boy suffers. Santino Di Matteo was made to understand that his cooperation with the state carried a price measured in his son's life. The captivity lasted an almost unimaginable length of time, roughly 779 days, more than 2 full years. A child abducted young grew older in captivity, held in darkness, while the men who guarded him waited for his father to yield. It is difficult to comprehend the endurance of such cruelty, sustained not in a moment of rage, but coldly, over more than 2 years, on the orders of a man who calculated that a suffering child was a useful lever against the state. Santino Di Matteo, for his part, was caught in an agony no parent should face. Every word of his testimony weighed against the life of his son. In the end, the lever failed to move the state, and Brusca's patience ran out. On January 11, 1996, on Giovanni Brusca's order, the boy was killed, and his body destroyed to deny his family even a grave to bury him in. He was 15 years old, a child who had spent his last years in chains. It was an act of such calculated barbarity that it recoiled even upon the men of Cosa Nostra, an organization not known for squeamishness. Among mafiosi themselves, the murder of the Di Matteo boy marked Brusca as something beyond the ordinary run of killers. He had crossed a line that even the code of a criminal brotherhood held sacred. The killing of a child, held in chains for over 2 years, became the defining atrocity of his life. By 1996, Giovanni Brusca stood at the summit of infamy. He had triggered the bomb that killed Falcone. He had helped organize a terror campaign against the cultural heart of Italy. And he had ordered the murder of an innocent boy to punish an informant. He was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous and reviled men in Europe. But he was also, by now, a fugitive, and the state he had spent years trying to break had not forgotten. The manhunt for the Corleonesi killers had never stopped, and slowly, through wiretaps and betrayals from within his own world, the investigators were closing the distance. After Salvatore Rina's arrest in January 1993, the Italian state pursued the remaining leadership of the Corleonesi with a relentlessness born of Capaci and Via D'Amelio, of Florence and the Di Matteo boy. Giovanni Brusca rose to the top of the list of Italy's most wanted men. He became a latitante, a fugitive, moving between hideouts across western Sicily, shielded by a network of loyalists, relatives, and the intimidated silence of the territory his family had long controlled around San Giuseppe Giotto. He had money, protection, and the accumulated fear of a region that knew what he was capable of. For a time, he seemed a ghost the state could not grasp. But the ground had shifted beneath Cosa Nostra. The bombs meant to break the Italian state had instead hardened it, and the wave of revulsion that followed the murder of Giuseppe Di Matteo had loosened tongues that might once have stayed silent. The investigators of the ROS Carabinieri and the DIA, Italy's specialized anti-Mafia agencies, worked the case with painstaking care. They tracked Brusca through wiretaps and, crucially, through betrayal from within. The same weapon of the pentito that Brusca had tried so savagely to punish now turned against him. Piece by piece, the surveillance closed around a farmhouse in the countryside near Canatello, in the Agrigento area on Sicily's southern coast, far from Brusca's home turf, where the fugitive believed he was safe. The date the investigators chose carried an almost novelistic irony. On May 20th, 1996, Giovanni Brusca's 39th birthday, the assault teams moved on the farmhouse. According to the accounts that followed, Brusca was inside with his brother Enzo and members of his family, relaxed, unsuspecting, marking the day. He was reportedly dressed in a Versace shirt, the wealthy killer at his ease, sitting before a television. In one of the details that would harden into legend, some accounts held that he was watching a drama connected to the anti-Mafia struggle at the very moment the officers came through the door. Whether that detail is precise or embroidered, the raw fact is not in dispute. The men of the state burst in and seized the man who had detonated the Capaci bomb. The arrest was electric with emotion. Among the officers who took Brusca were men connected to the anti-Mafia war he had waged against, men who had lost colleagues at Capaci. To have the slaughterer of Falcone in their hands, alive, in handcuffs, was almost more than some could bear. Accounts of the arrest describe officers weeping, others struggling to contain a rage that demanded release, restraining themselves by sheer discipline. Here at last was verru, the pig, not a phantom on a hillside, not a name in a wiretap, but a frightened man in a designer shirt, pulled from a sofa on his birthday. Brusca and his brother Enzo were taken into custody, and word flashed across Italy that one of the last great architects of the Mafia's war on the state had fallen. He had killed men with his own hands and lost count somewhere past 100. He had pressed the button that turned a half-mile of Sicilian highway into a crater and erased Giovanni Falcone from the living world. He had given the order that ended the life of a chained child. And now, in the summer of 1996, in the custody of the Italian state, Giovanni Brusca made a decision that stunned everyone who knew his name. He decided to talk. He would become a pentito, a collaboratore di giustizia, a collaborator with justice, a state witness. He would trade the secrets of Cosa Nostra for a reduction of the sentences that would otherwise bury him alive. And here the story folds back on itself with an irony so bitter it is almost unbearable. The legal machinery that made his collaboration possible, the entire apparatus of incentives for mafiosi who broke omerta, had been championed and refined by prosecutors like Giovanni Falcone himself. Falcone had understood, better than anyone, that Cosa Nostra could not be defeated from the outside. It had to be cracked open from within, one turned insider at a time. He had built the instrument, and now the man who had murdered him reached out and took hold of that same instrument to save his own skin. The state did not welcome him with open arms. Almost immediately, Brusca's account was met with suspicion, and the suspicion was well earned. Prosecutors found his early testimony evasive, self-serving, riddled with convenient gaps. He minimized his own role. He seemed to reveal only what he calculated he could not conceal. Other pentiti openly called him a liar. For a long stretch, the men whose job it was to weigh his words considered him unreliable, a collaborator in name, who was still, in his heart, playing the old game of concealment and advantage. There was a real fear that the state had made a devil's bargain and received counterfeit coin in return. But slowly, under pressure and over years of interrogation, the coin turned real. Brusca began to give up the architecture of the organization he had served since boyhood, the chain of command, the commission of bosses, the rituals of initiation, the internal logic of terror. He described the planning of Capaci in granular detail: the stolen explosive, the culvert beneath the motorway, the rehearsals, the men on the hillside with the radio detonator. He laid out the strategy behind the season of bombs that followed. He led investigators to bodies. He pointed them toward buried arsenals of weapons and explosives. And he testified in open court against the men he had once called brothers and masters, against Toto Rina, the boss of bosses who had given him his orders, and against Leoluca Bagarella, Rina's brother-in-law and Brusca's own partner in blood. Whatever else he was he became, in the cold accounting of the courts, useful. This was precisely the logic Falcone had gambled his life on, that even a monster's testimony could be a weapon against the thing that made the monster. But the logic was one thing, and the human cost of it was another, and to the families of the dead the arrangement was not justice at all. It was obscene. Maria Falcone, sister of the murdered judge, had spent the years since Capaci carrying her brother's memory into schools and courtrooms and public squares. She understood the law her brother had believed in, understood it more deeply, perhaps, than the politicians who invoked it. But understanding did not make it painless to watch the man who had detonated the bomb receive the benefits of that very law. And then there was Santino Di Matteo, himself a pentito, whose own decision to collaborate had set the whole nightmare in motion. It was to punish Santino's cooperation that Cosa Nostra had taken his young son and finally killed him on the order that Brusca gave. Now that same Brusca sat across from prosecutors as a collaborator, protected by the same statutes, chasing the same reductions. For a father who had lost his child to Brusca's cruelty, there were no words adequate to the anguish of it. The symmetry was monstrous. Justice, in this shape, felt like a second injury laid over the first. The public revulsion was immediate, and it did not fade. To millions of Italians, the arithmetic was simple and intolerable. This was verru, the pig, the slaughterer of human beings, and the state was preparing to give him something in return for his words. The prosecutors could explain the necessity. The lawyers could cite the statute. But no explanation reached the place where ordinary people kept their sense of right and wrong. And beneath all of it lay a question no one in Italy wanted to ask aloud, because everyone already sensed the answer. If Giovanni Brusca collaborated, and if the law rewarded collaboration as it was written to do, then the sentences that should have entombed him forever would not, in the end, be forever. There would come a morning, years away, but real, when the machinery would finish its work, and the door would open, and a man like this would step back into the sunlight and breathe the same air as the families of the people he had killed. The reckoning arrived slowly, in the patient grammar of the Italian courts. Brusca was tried and convicted for the crimes he had spent his life committing: the Capaci massacre, the murder of the Di Matteo child, a catalogue of killings that ran from his teenage years to his capture. In the ordinary course of things, the verdicts meant life. He was handed life terms. But because he had collaborated, because the pentiti statutes that Falcone helped build promised reductions to those who broke omerta, his punishment was not what it would otherwise have been. The life sentences were softened by the law's own logic. His years were counted, and there were fewer of them than his crimes deserved, and everyone understood why, and no one could quite bear it. Then, on the last day of May 2021, roughly 25 years after the police had pulled him from that farmhouse near Agrigento on his 39th birthday, the counting reached its end. Giovanni Brusca had served the sentence his collaboration had earned him, and so, on or around the 31st of May 2021, he was released from prison. He was placed under libertà vigilata, supervised liberty, a period of roughly 4 years in which the state would watch him, but he was, in every sense that mattered to the people who hated him, a free man. He walked out. The pig walked out. The country erupted. The release detonated a national outrage that crossed every line of party and region. Politicians denounced it from the floors of Parliament. Commentators called it an insult to the dead. The arithmetic that had appalled Italians in 1996 now stood complete and undeniable in 2021. The man who had murdered Giovanni Falcone, the man who had ordered a child killed, had done his time and gone home, while his victims remained exactly as dead as he had made them. Falcone was still in his grave in Palermo. Giuseppe Di Matteo had no grave at all, and Giovanni Brusca had a front door and a key. It fell, as it so often had, to Maria Falcone to speak the words that held the contradiction without shattering under it. She did not pretend the release was easy. She spoke of pain, of the difficulty of accepting that this man could be free. But she also did something harder. She defended the law. This, she reminded a furious nation, was the law her brother had believed in, the rule of law itself, the principle that even a state fighting monsters must keep its own word. The pentiti statutes had been Giovanni Falcone's own conviction, his wager that mercy toward the informer was the price of victory over the organization. To tear that principle up now, however satisfying, would have been to betray the very thing her brother had died defending. She carried both truths at once, and she did not flinch from either. And that is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire story, refusing to resolve. The pentiti law worked. It is credited, by the prosecutors and historians who studied Cosa Nostra's decline, with breaking the back of the Sicilian Mafia, with turning its secrets against it, hollowing out its power, saving an untold number of lives. It was Falcone's instrument, and it did what he built it to do. But the instrument had a price, and the price was written into it from the beginning. To buy the testimony that destroyed the organization, the state had to promise the men who testified that their monstrousness would not be answered in full. The law that broke Cosa Nostra was the same law that opened Giovanni Brusca's cell. He had detonated the bomb at Capaci that killed the architect of the pentiti system. And then he had climbed to freedom on the ladder that same architect had built. He murdered the man and inherited the man's mercy. There is no version of this in which the accounts balance, no ledger where 100 and more murders, a judge torn apart on a highway, a child in chains, are weighed against 25 years and found equal. They are not equal. They will never be equal. The law did not claim they were. It claimed only that the greater evil, the organization itself, endless and self-renewing, could be defeated no other way, and that the freedom of a monster was the coin required to purchase the safety of the many. So Giovanni Brusca lives, somewhere in Italy, under whatever watch the state still keeps. Verru grows older than his victims were ever allowed to grow. And Giovanni Falcone lies in Palermo, and the boy has no resting place, and the families carry their dead through every ordinary day. This is where the story leaves us. In the hard and honest silence it refuses to fill with comfort. The killer was set free by the machinery of the man he killed.